Probably the best character to focus on if you want to discuss whether Shakespeare was attacking King James at the same time as appearing to support him is Banquo. And if we examine the real Banquo compared to Shakespeare's version, we get some interesting possibilities. So Shakespeare borrowed the character of Banquo again from Holinshed's Chronicles, a history of Britain published by Raphael Holinshed in 1587. In the Chronicles, Banquo is an accomplice to Macbeth in the murder of the king, rather than, as he is in the play, a loyal subject of the king who is seen as an enemy by Macbeth, because he doesn't tell Macbeth that he will side with him once he suspects that Macbeth killed Duncan. Shakespeare may have changed this aspect of his character in order to please King James, who was thought at the time to be a descendant of the real Banquo. And critics often interpret Banquo's role in the play as being a foil to Macbeth. If you think of Macbeth as the protagonist, we can think of Banquo as the antagonist, his opposite, because he resists evil where Macbeth embraces it. So looked at this way, the creation of Banquo is entirely motivated politically, where Shakespeare does it out of self-interest to promote King James as a noble man descended from a noble ancestor, Banquo. But if we dig a little deeper, we'll see that Shakespeare undermines that idea. So sometimes, however, his motives are unclear. This is Banquo's motives. And some critics question his purity, whether he's a moral man or not. He does nothing to accuse Macbeth of murdering the king, even though he's got incredibly good reasons to believe Macbeth is responsible, because he saw how Macbeth reacted. He said, our partner looks rapt withal, when he was considering the witch's prophecies. I fear thou playedst most foully for it. So it's very clear here in this aside that Banquo actually believes Macbeth has murdered Duncan. Well, the obvious thing to do would be to expose him here, but he doesn't. He bides his time because, we could argue, he's corrupt. He knows that having Macbeth as king is the first of the witches, is the third of the witches' prophecies about Macbeth, but that must happen first before Fleance can become king. So Banquo's got a really strong motive for keeping Macbeth as king, because he knows that will then make the rest of the prophecy come true, which will be that Fleance becomes king at some point. And of course, Fleance can't become king till he's an adult, so Banquo knows Macbeth has to remain in power for some time yet, because Fleance himself won't yet be ready. Now, interestingly, in Shakespeare's day, they were considered historical figures, Banquo and Fleance, and that they were considered figures of great repute, really noble. And the king, James I, based his claim to the throne in part on a descent from Banquo. So Shakespeare will be playing a really dangerous game if he suggests that Banquo is immoral. But he still does that. He still leaves enough clues in the play to suggest that Banquo is not a totally moral character. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? At the same time, he has Macbeth kill Banquo because he sees Banquo as too noble, and he gives Banquo the heroic death where he sacrifices himself in order to preserve his son's life. So he's presented as a truly heroic character that way. However, it's what Banquo doesn't do that undermines this, and Shakespeare does that deliberately, to introduce an element of doubt as to whether King James is really descended from this noble person, because Shakespeare knows from Holinshed that Banquo was a murderer who killed Duncan. So it's quite a subtle game that Shakespeare is playing. The House of Stuart, this is King James was a Stuart, was descended from Walter FitzAlan, the first High Steward of Scotland, and he was believed to have been the grandson of Fleance and Griffith ap Llewellyn's daughter. So really what we're seeing here is that these names were all known, a famous family from whom James I was descended. So Shakespeare, of course, changes Banquo's role so that he is no longer the murderer. It is, in fact, Macbeth and his wife. So the first reason that Shakespeare might have changed that history is the risk associated with portraying the king's ancestor as a murderer and the conspirator in the plot to overthrow a rightful king, as well as the author's desire to flatter a powerful patron in King James. But Shakespeare may also simply have altered Banquo's character because there was a need to provide a dramatic contrast to Macbeth. So this is where you can structurally talk about Macbeth needing an antithesis, an opposite to himself. He's a protagonist, and then we have Banquo as an antagonist. And that contrast shows how evil Macbeth is through our appreciation of how noble Banquo is. But I prefer a more subtle discussion when you're actually thinking if Shakespeare is also suggesting that Banquo is not quite as noble as he is portrayed. Let's analyse some quotations which will take us further in this discussion. So in Act 2, Scene 1, Banquo meets his son Fleance and asks him to take both his sword and his dagger. Hold, take my sword, take thee that too. He completely disarms himself. Well, yes, that could be a symbolic way of handing over his power to his son, as though he himself knows that he's going to die. So it could symbolise Banquo's nobility. He also explains that he's been having trouble sleeping due to curses, thoughts that nature gives way to in repose. So he's been having nightmares. Now that could be a reference to the witches attacking him through their supernatural power, and he is resisting them. So I've given you two ways of interpreting Banquo's words as showing how noble, how moral, and how good he is. On Macbeth's approach, he demands the sword returned to him quickly. Scholars have interpreted this to mean that Banquo has been dreaming of murdering the king. So now is an opportunity for us to think, well, is he actually a good character? So he doesn't trust himself with his sword or his dagger. He fears that he'll be tempted to use it to kill Duncan, because killing Duncan will make Macbeth king quicker, which will make Fleance king quicker. So actually, we could see this as a psychological battle Banquo is having with his own evil nature, just as Macbeth has done. So he could have been dreaming of murdering the king as Macbeth's accomplice, which of course is exactly what happened historically. And the motive is to take the throne for his own family, as the three witches prophesied to him. In this reading, his good nature is so revolted by these thoughts that he gives his sword and dagger to Fleance. So he does eventually prove his goodness by removing the temptation to kill, to be sure that the prophecy doesn't come true, but is so nervous at Macbeth's approach that he demands them back. So another way of reading it is that Banquo is fearful that Macbeth is going to kill Fleance, as well as him, and so he wants to be armed as soon as Macbeth is present. It is very odd, isn't it, that Banquo would feel the need to be armed at his best friend's castle. Or alternatively, you can see Banquo as wholly good. His dreams are not about his own desires to kill. They could be about his fear for his son's life at the hands of Macbeth. So when Macbeth approaches, Banquo, having had bad dreams about what Macbeth is going to do, takes back his sword as a precaution because he suspects that Macbeth wishes to kill him and Fleance. Personally, however, I'm quite attracted to the idea that Shakespeare is thinking of the real Banquo in the Chronicles and is therefore quite cynical about how good a king James might turn out to be. He might be just as corrupt as Banquo is. And if we think about the witch trials that we heard about earlier, where James has acted as a judge condemning uh, people as witches, if Shakespeare doesn't believe in witchcraft, then he will see King James as acting in an evil way, condemning innocent people to death and torturing them beforehand. And he might go further and see the torturing of the Catholic conspirators in the Gunpowder Plot as a deeply evil act, especially if he was actually sympathetic to their cause, if he was Catholic himself. So, if you found that useful, get ready for the next video on Shakespeare, the Man of Business.